I don't hear us.
Tēnā rā koutou. For those of you who are joining in now, we'll just give it a little bit of time for our participants to arrive.
I can still see you, Geetha, so beautiful.
So for those of you who are coming in, please remember to mute your mics. And if you can also use the question and answer function to post questions to the panel this evening. That would be really useful, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions as we go. All right, we'll give it 30 more seconds. All right, whānau, let's get started. Me kara ki a tātou. Tui, tui, tui tuia. Tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I roto, tuia I waho. Tuia te here tangata ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Tuia te muka tangata I tā kia mai I Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, I Hawaii ki pāmāmau. Te hono a wairua whakaputa ki te whai ao, ki te ao mārama, ti hei mauri ora. Tuatahi ki te atua I runga rawa, nāna nei ngā mea katoa, kororia ki tō ingoa tapu. Tuarua e te kingi Māori tūheitia namatua whitu, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe. Tuatoru ki ngā iwi o te motu nei, hei hāpai te mana motu haki o te iwi Māori tēnei mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Kia koutou katoa, ngā kaiako rawa me ngā kai whakamatautau rawa o te whare tohu rata o Aotearoa, he mihi mai o hā kia koutou katoa. Ko wai e noho nei, ko kake puku te maunga, ko waipā te awa, ko tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Maniapoto te iwi, ko Mōteti te marae, ko Sarah Shasha, tōku ingoa. Tēnā rā koutou katoa, and welcome on in everybody. It's lovely to have you here tonight for our cultural safety webinar for our GP teachers, our medical educators and our clinical examiners. So tonight I've opened with an incantation Māori to provide us all a safe space for tonight's kōrero. And I greeted our kingi tūheitia and also our iwi Māori across Aotearoa who are holding tight to who they are and what they stand for. And to you all, our amazing GP teachers, medical educators and clinical examiners who ensure we can continue to provide a safe and well-educated GP workforce in Aotearoa. Thank you so much for all the mahi that you do. So my name is Sarah Shasha and I'm a member of Te Akoranga a Māui, so our rōpū Māori for the College of GPs. I've been within the college, I've been in roles with the National Advisory Council. I've been a medical educator delivering te ahunga in Wellington and Palmerston North. I've worked in our multi-use educator group for the college, and I've also been lucky enough to be able to write a case, and I will be a clinical examiner this year for the college. And also I've been a GP for Orotoa PHO, so that's Ngāti Tuarangatiras Iwi Health Service here for the past 10 years. And I just want to share a few things with you before I introduce the wonderful people who are here with me tonight. So I am a wahine Māori, and I have explicit bias towards Māori. I've spent much of my time since starting medicine as a student searching for who I am. Who I am as Māori. What does it mean to be a true Māori? because even now I don't feel skilled or knowledgeable enough to be Māori. I have been reclaiming parts of my identity I didn't know existed. My language, Te Reo Māori, being one of the most important parts of me that I don't yet feel like I own. My knowledge of Te Ao Māori that allows me to share the intricacies of who we are as Indigenous peoples, I still am learning. Both he whakapūtanga o te rangatiratanga o New Tireni and te tiriti o Waitangi were layers of protection that should have prevented me feeling this way about who I am or who I could be. The Crown promised iwi Māori our protection, our sovereignty, our right to equal opportunity. So how can it be that as a wahine Māori, I don't feel Māori enough? We all know the answer to this question. And therefore, as influential people within our communities, who best to right the wrong in what we are experts at, caring for people. And we can transform the way we care for people by adding layers of te tiriti and he whakapūtanga, so our Declaration of Independence, within our services and organisations that recognise the importance of seating Māori at every level of hierarchy to provide the Indigenous voice that knows what it needs. With our health system reform introducing te whatu ora and te aka whai ora, change is happening. And we already well know that general practice is an integral component of the system. We are at the coalface and potentially that first meaningful interaction a patient might have with the health system. So it's important we do what we can to set the standard of cultural safety in health. The Pai Ora Healthy Futures Act, Y2575, the Health and Disability System Review, the Cultural Safety Baseline Data Report done in partnership between the Medical Council and Te Ora, our Māori Doctors Association, as well as extensive research. And actually, our own experiences as GPs in Aotearoa informs us that in order to achieve health equity in Aotearoa, much needs to change. And if we focus on what we can control, that involves strengthening our understanding of what it means to have a culturally safe clinical consultation. That's important so we can educate our next generations. So I sit here as an advocate not only for Māori, but for all in our communities of Aotearoa who haven't had fair opportunity to firstly have confident health-seeking behaviours, to secondly be able to access healthcare, and once they have done so, feel empowered by a clinically and culturally safe interaction with a doctor who has given them the opportunity to contribute to the decisions that will enable them good health. Regardless of who we are, how we define ourselves, and what journeys we decide to take, we need a health system full of clinicians who are aware of the impact of colonisation in Aotearoa, who have addressed their implicit biases, who engage in critical self-reflection, who seek balance of power within consultation, and who encourage contribution to the decision-making that is meaningful to the patient. And this is so important and purposeful right now. We have a wonderful GPEP curriculum at the moment that infuses equity, te tiriti o Waitangi, and we have a wonderful Hauora Māori curriculum that has been injected into our college most recently too. And with that, so too has our exam rubric for the clinical Primex exams has now transformed to ensure that cultural safety is at the heart of the assessments at the end of GPEP 1 year. So tonight, it is my absolute privilege to introduce you to other like-minded cultural safety enthusiasts who care about health equity in Aotearoa and who have kindly offered their time to contribute to strengthening our knowledge of cultural safety as educators within the college. So two of our panelists you will know well. Doctors Lucy O'Hagan, our lead MUE and also medical educator here in Wellington. Dr. Kyle Eggleton, who is on the Academic Tāhuhu board of the college and who holds many hats also, and to introduce you to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Bronwyn Chesterfield, who is a public health physician with HQSC. And I'll take the time to introduce them more before each of them start their kōrero. So thank you for joining us this evening. It's quite a feast of pro-equity kōrero, and I'm glad that you're here with us and you care enough to be here. So with that in mind, please remember to ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will be screening the questions and doing my best to answer them, and the hope will be that I can collate the themes and we can have a discussion at the end of this kōrero. Hopefully an hour and a half, but we might go over because you know how important this kaupapa is for our GP trainees and for us as people working in general practice in Aotearoa. So, nau mai e hua. Can I introduce you all to Dr. Bronwyn Chesterfield, Public Health Medicine Specialist for HQSC, and also Chair of the National Immunisation Programme's Quality and Safety Framework Working Group for Te Whatuora. Bronwyn's public health experience has involved roles as Senior Equity Advisor on the National Bowel Screening Programme Implementation Team. It's covered population health in Hawke's Bay and mahi with Te Awa Kairangi Health Primary Care Network locally here within the Hutt Valley. She has a broad experience in medicine, having worked in general medicine, anaesthetics, intensive care and emergency medicine during her time here in Aotearoa. Both Bronwyn and I delivered a pilot cultural safety workshop for the Medical Council this year with exceptional feedback. And so I have invited Bronwyn to be with us tonight. Bronwyn will share some of her own personal reflections and experiences regarding recognising Māori health inequities in Aotearoa, and will invite you to better understand the power of discrimination and bias in medicine so that we as clinicians do not contribute to the perpetuation of institutional racism in Aotearoa. Kaya koe e hoa. Come on in.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi ke te kaiwhakarite mo tēnei hui, Sarah. Ngā mihi nui mō te kōrero. Ke tātou e tōnei kanu te mihi, kanu te mihi, kanu te mihi. Ko Craig Linton Monga, ko Nef ta awa, ko Cymru Cymraeg te iwi, no Cymru aho. Ko te whanganui a tara tōku kāinga, ko tangata tiriti aho. Ko Bronwyn Chesterfield tōku ingoa, ko tāku tāho, no reira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Kia ora tātou katoa. Well, it's lovely to be here this evening. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to all those who have chosen to join us. We are delighted that you are here. And I'm very proud to be part of this wonderful panel. And so pleased that you've welcomed me as a non-GP into this space. So thank you for having me. So I'm just going to attempt to share screen. Let's all cross our fingers and toes that the technology works. Here we go. How does that look for you guys? All good? Excellent.
Yeah, perfect. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a public health physician, finished my training in June this year, and I work for HQSC. For most of the past 2 years, I've been working within HQSC as a registrar, and I spend a lot of time within the Māori health unit there, for most of the time as the only non-Māori kaimahi. So I've been very fortunate to have that exposure to Te Ao Māori, which has really helped develop my thinking in this area. However, the views I express this evening are my own. They are not representative of my employer or any other groups that I'm affiliated with. And I just wanted to say that some of the things I'll be discussing this evening may make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I just want to acknowledge that, because some of this stuff is uncomfortable, but I ask that you do try and work through that discomfort. Also, I am not an expert in this kaupapa. As Sarah mentioned, I am a cultural safety enthusiast, and I'm on my own journey as well. So hopefully, whichever stage you're at of your own journey, there will be something in this that will be of use to you, I hope. So ko waio, who am I? I'm originally from South Wales. There's a photograph of me there wearing my Welsh national costume, which is adorable. I think we'll all agree.
So I had my education through the medium of the Welsh language, so a similar process to the Kohanga Reo Te Kura Kaupapa system here. My parents could not speak Welsh. My great-grandmother was beaten for speaking Welsh and humiliated in school until she stopped speaking Welsh, so it wasn't handed down through the generations in my whānau. For those who don't know much about Wales, we were colonised a long time ago by the tribes that became the English and experienced dispossession of our land and cultural oppression. So I had some understanding, a little bit of understanding before I came here of things that perhaps other Pākehā wouldn't have the insight into because of that background, which did sort of help me have a little bit more insight. I went to med school in Scotland and I worked in the NHS for a couple of years before emigrating to Aotearoa in 2006. And I worked in Rotorua Hospital, top left there, which was a wonderful experience. But I noticed really soon after arriving that there was a difference in the health status of my Māori patients relative to non-Māori. I noticed they were more likely to live in poverty and have diseases and conditions related to poverty. I also noticed quite a lot of casual racism amongst the staff. And part of the reason probably because I am not from here. So as an outsider, it was perhaps a little bit more obvious to me. I hadn't been, I guess, conditioned not to see it, having not been brought up here. So that was a big one for me. And I also noticed that I had trouble relating to my Māori patients and getting a rapport with them. They wouldn't make eye contact with me. They were often monosyllabic. And I was really worried about this and wondering why this was happening. And one day someone corrected my pronunciation of their name. And I realized that I'd been mispronouncing Māori names and places for the whole time I'd been there. Part of that was my own ignorance, and part of it was copying my New Zealand European colleagues who were also mispronouncing names. I thought, oh my goodness, I need to sort this out because it must be coming across as very disrespectful. So I signed up for a course, level 2 course in Te Reo, Te Wānanga o Aotearoa, and I was the only Pākehā. And it made, it was a turning point for me, I guess. I learned a lot during that course, not just some basic reo, but I also learned about the stories from my fellow students about their experiences of structural racism and colonisation and the impacts it had on them and their whānau. So it really helped open my eyes. I then moved to Hawke's Bay. I was doing anaesthesia training at that stage. Again, similar problems I was noticing. Went down to Wellington. I worked in ICU there and back in anaesthesia. And again, I was noticing the same issues and also the same sort of casual racism and the same structural barriers to accessing care. I then decided to go into public health medicine training. And during my training, as Sarah mentioned, I worked at a PHO and I worked in some central agencies. And I noticed, again, racism manifesting there in things like representation in different groups. So I noticed Māori were often marginalised in things like advisory groups, even for issues where we were doing really poorly for Māori. There'd often just be one Māori representative and like 20 Pākehā. So we were sort of deliberately marginalising the Māori voice. And there was a real strong sense of Eurocentricity, that the European way was the right way. And I thought that was a real barrier actually to moving forward and addressing health inequities. So that sort of started me off being really interested in this subject, and I've tried to learn more and more about it. And I'll share some of those things that I've learned with you this evening, and I hope they'll be useful to you. So these are the things we're going to cover. And there's much more that we could talk about, of course, but hopefully this will give you some fundamentals that will help assist you on your own journey. So what is cultural safety? Well, it was a term that was first coined in a Māori nursing hui back in 1988. And this hui was called because Māori nurses were concerned about the dropout rates for Māori nursing students and the standard of care provided to whānau when they were in hospital. They were discussing things like legal safety, ethical safety, and a first-year student from Te Arawa, so relatively new to studying nursing, stood up and said, well, what about cultural safety? And this term was taken by Iri Hapati Ramsden, who was a Māori nurse and academic and a real amazing wahine and a real thinker. And she developed it further from there. So what's involved is self-reflection and self-assessment. So identify issues in your own practice where you may be acting in a biased way, recognizing the power imbalance within consultations. And we'll come back to this notion of power and explore that in a little bit more depth. And consciously not imposing our own cultural values and practices on patients' whānau, and respecting the values and practices of patients. And it's important also challenging the biases of your own colleagues and systematic biases. So having those difficult conversations. It does require a critical reflective practice, and it is essentially a decolonizing process. So what makes cultural safety different from cultural competence? Well, it's all about the self. It's not about the exotic other or the different other learning their language and their cultural practices, but it shines the light on us. So all of us have been patterned. Our biases have been patterned by where we're from, our own culture, what our parents thought, what our families thought, our religion, etc. So it's really examining that and how it's affecting us in our lives and the way we work. You can conceptualize it as one-on-one as it was originally conceived of, but also you can conceptualize it at a more organizational or institutional level. And it can be thought of as an imbalance between provider and patient in terms of power, and also a power imbalance between fertility partners for Māori. And again, there are barriers to clinical effectiveness and achieving equitable outcomes. It is certainly more challenging and confronting. I think most people will agree with that. And whether that service is culturally safe is determined by the patient, not by the doctor. So a little bit more about this idea of power. So power is relational and it's context specific. So myself as a female doctor, I may have a lot of power in a certain social group situation, hui, and in another one I may have absolutely very little power at all. So in that way, it is distinct from income and wealth as a fundamental cause of health inequities. So it's important, in order to tackle inequities, we have to explicitly redress power imbalances to the benefit of disadvantaged groups. And power is something that's actually recognized by the World Health Organization in their conceptual framework for action on the social determinants of health. So a little bit more about the individual versus organizational aspects. So it's important to try and reflect, I think, on the values and beliefs that underpin our culture and our cultural norms, because it's something we've become desensitized to and don't really see. So it's important to have the ability to try and take a step outside ourselves, take a step back, and try and look at things objectively, because of course all our services are based on sort of fundamental worldview. It's important to appreciate how our biases play out in our decisions at work, and that's at every level of the health system. Much of the bias is unconscious, and my other panelist colleagues this evening will go into this in a bit more detail. But what it tends to do in Aotearoa is just reinforce and normalizes that Eurocentric monoculturalism, that the European way is the best way, and that is superior, and that's how we should do things. And it just reinforces and normalizes that view. I want to talk a little bit about language and framing, because I think this is important, because it's done a lot. I'd like you to have a look at these cartoons. They're probably ones that you've seen before. I imagine the one on the left is probably the most familiar. So when I first saw this, I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't think anything negative of it. I thought, oh, that's quite a clever way of explaining the difference between equality and equity. But if you look at those people on the left there, you'll notice that the smallest one, is physically smaller than everyone else. I think it subliminally suggests that there's something intrinsically about them that means that they are incapable, that means that they're stunted or genetically inferior in some way to the others, and that's where they need more. And I have read sort of other people's views on that also share my concern about that cartoon and what it's sort of trying to suggest to us, or reinforcing any biases that we may already have. So I've now only used the cartoon on the right side, where you can see all the people are in those stylized colors. They're all the same height. And you'll notice what's different is the fence and the ground. So words are really important. Images are important. The way we describe people shape what other people see. It can make it really easier to blame others, and they themselves become the problem. And I just thought about this expats versus migrants thing, because I've noticed since I've been in Aotearoa that I'm often described as an expat from the UK. I'm not often described as a migrant, but I don't often hear the word expat applied to people who are brown. It's mainly just to white people like me from the UK or the US. So it made me think a little bit about why that is. Am I a sort of better class of migrant because I'm from the UK? I'm a sort of expat. It's interesting to think about. So we do often use a lot of deficit framing, and it does help desensitize us a bit. Vulnerable populations is one that I think occurs really frequently, and many of you may have seen this popping up in documents all the time. I think it does suggest a weakness and a lack of agency. And there's a really good quote from Professor Marcia Anderson, which some of you may have heard of. So she is an Indigenous woman from Canada. And she says, from now on, instead of vulnerable people, I'm going to use the phrase, people we oppress through policy choices and discourses of racial inferiority. It's a bit longer, but I think it will help us focus on when the problems actually lie. So this really resonated with me when I first read it, so much so that I wrote it on the back of my notebook at work, and I do refer to it often. So I want to talk a little bit about racism with a spotlight on white people. And again, I acknowledge that some of this will be uncomfortable. Even just talking about white people in terms of white can make people feel a bit nervous, because we're not really used to seeing ourselves racially labeled, I think. So it's an abnormal thing. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I wanted to put in this graph here, which many of you, again, will be very familiar with. So this is NZDEP. Again, with for Māori and non-Māori, and you can see it's really heavily skewed towards deprivation for Māori, with non-Māori, which is predominantly European, far more evenly distributed and slightly skewed towards the least deprived. I wanted to start with this because for me, this really encapsulates structural racism, because this is entirely manufactured, and it's been this way for decades. So this is a result of processes and systems that privilege one group deliberately over another and dispossess and marginalize the other group. So where does this idea of racism come from? Well, it's a sociological invention. It's made up basically like the idea of whiteness. And it was the need to create this idea, this ideology, was to justify enslavement of Africans. So initially the thought was that Africans are not Christian, so they could be enslaved. But then many Africans started to become Christian. And then another reason was needed to enslave them. And they decided to create this idea of whiteness, which interested me because I didn't realize that it was that way round. I thought that racism justified enslavement, but actually it was the other way around. And also with that came this idea of racial hierarchy. So races having different value, intrinsic value, with the white race at the sort of apex of that pyramid. And with the idea of racial hierarchies came the idea of racial purity. So you could be pure races. This is a very European concept. Indigenous people often don't, they really don't have the same ideas about, percentages by race, etc. For example, for Māori, if you whakapapa Māori, then you're Māori, that's it. Whereas we have all these ideas about percentages of race, and it's all just made up. We know genetically there's more difference within an ethnic group genetically than there is between ethnic groups. So it was just a way of trying to justify white supremacy. And of course, in colonized countries such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, or when the settlers came here, they had that image in their mind of their own superiority, and that justified the exploitation of Indigenous lands and people. And they were completely convinced in their superiority, not just racially, but culturally, linguistically, spiritually, in every way superior to the Indigenous people, and that justified what they did. I just wanted to show this this painting, The Arrival of the Maoris in New Zealand, because it was important as part of justifying the narrative to create these sorts of stories, rewrite history, if you like. So you see here a group of Māori. They are emaciated, they are distressed, their waka's falling apart, it's got holes in it, and then one of them suddenly sees land, thank goodness. But of course, in reality, we know that Māori, like all Pacific peoples, were a seafaring people. They were very clever, experienced navigators who crossed the Pacific Ocean many, many times. But of course, that didn't fit with our belief in our superiority. So we had to sort of try and portray them differently. So what is a racist? So this is a good one, because I think the word racism is really emotive, and it really makes people shut down, and so does the word racist. I think we need to rethink this concept. So when I used to think of the word racist, I saw these gentlemen down the bottom there. So this is a group of white supremacists from Christchurch. This is the sort of people I see. Whereas in reality, of course, racists aren't, I mean, these are certainly racist, but most people who are racist are just normal, everyday people who make decisions consciously and mostly unconsciously that favour their own social group over others. And if people get very defensive or hurt or upset or angry and shut down when someone suggests that they might be acting in a racially biased way or a racist way, that is called white fragility, which some of you may have heard of as well. But because people are so sensitized to this word, and I'm just speaking in terms of white people here because that's the group I belong to, it just serves to allow us to shut down the conversation and we can walk away. But of course, if we do that, nothing changes. We leverage all our privilege to be able to do nothing because nothing changes for us if we do that, you know. It only serves to protect the system of racism. In my view, the status quo persists unchallenged. And one of the definitions of racism by Kamara Jones is inaction in the face of need. If you haven't read any of the work of Kamara Jones, please do so. She is a remarkable woman. And so we just perpetuate the racism when we do that. So I think that's why it's important that we desensitize to the word racism and racist, that we really try and engage with this subject and that we really look at ourselves through that lens. I thought I'd mention reverse racism because this comes up quite often, I think, in Aotearoa. You see lots of media stuff about this. It's a bit of a perverse idea. So this is when you get critics of affirmative actions criticizing race-based policies, and they claim that they are actually the heralds of racial equality. So any attempts to sort of address that imbalance are cut down. And I think an example of that recently was when a review was demanded of the way that medical schools privilege Māori Pacific and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think this happens often, and it's something to be aware of and to try and ensure that we are giving the right messages so that people understand the purpose of these sorts of policies, because it's so important that they are protected and that they continue, but they are quite fragile. You can see how without having the right understanding of the purpose of them, they are at risk. So thinking a little bit about this social conditioning. So we've all been racially socialized. That's something that's really important to understand. It's inevitable by growing up in racialized societies. The question isn't, are we racially socialized? The question is how is it manifesting in our lives? How is it manifesting in our decision-making and our working lives? Just wanted to pop in this quote by John Key. So he says, when we talk about the treaty and sovereignty and all those matters, you take a step back and say, well, what was really happening? In my view, New Zealand was one of the very few countries in the world that was settled peacefully. Māori probably acknowledged the settlers had a place to play and brought with them lots of skills and lots of capital. So during my time in New Zealand, I've noticed that quite a lot of white people, New Zealand Europeans here, have been insulated really from understanding their own history. They've not been educated about it. They've had a very Te Ao Pākehā view, which has been quite sanitized of all the sort of, you know, the violence of colonization. And I noticed that most of the people I met when I arrived here couldn't speak a lot of reo. They may have only had a couple of words maximum. The New Zealand Europeans I met, which sort of surprised me. I just thought, to be honest, I thought everyone would have a good understanding of te reo. Many New Zealand Europeans, I think, don't understand much about Māori rights, Māori realities and their aspirations. And I think it's probably a form of deliberate whitewashing, really, and part of socialization into that system. So what is systemic racism? Well, we all have these socially learned prejudices, but systemic racism happens when that collective racial prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. So those are really important things to understand. Legal authority, institutional control. It transforms and embeds that prejudice into all aspects of society and what we consider normal, valuable, correct, etc. So the ideology underpinning colonization continues, and it just assumes new forms. We all have bias, and xenophobia is a pretty universal human trait. But racism is a system. So just taking this from Robin DiAngelo from the US, if you haven't read anything by her, please do. She's really excellent. So this is state-sanctioned discrimination against Māori. So you can see right from the very beginning, all the way down to the present day. It is systematic, it is methodical, it is deliberate. So the dispossession of Māori, the deflection of wealth and land to Europeans and to their descendants, protecting that wealth, protecting that power was really, really important. And I've heard this quite a lot as well. Well, I didn't do it. My ancestors may have done it, but I'm not liable for that. Well, in my view, we all benefit from the dispossession of Māori. I benefit from it as a white migrant. I've come here. I was able to assimilate really easily into the society here because, you know, it's very familiar to me coming from the UK. My children fit in really well here. The systems that exist here privilege people who look like me. So I absolutely benefited from colonization. I benefited from the dispossession of Māori. The intricate sort of web of laws and norms that maintain disparities in wealth, education, housing, incarceration, access to political power, basically what white supremacy is something I directly benefit from as a white person in Aotearoa. And it's very unpleasant thinking about that and acknowledging that, but I think it's something we have to face up to. So what does it mean to be white? This is something I've been thinking about recently because I was talking to my husband a few months ago and I sort of realized that I'd never actually thought of myself as having race. You know, like race is something that other people have, like brown people, whereas I didn't even think of myself in racial terms, which is really a bit weird actually, but I think it's just part of that thinking that you're the normal group and everyone's compared to you. And this is a quote by Richard Dyer. So he says, as long as race is something only applied to non-white peoples, as long as white people are not racially seen and named, we just function as a human norm. Other people are raced, we're just people. You know, there's no more powerful position than that of being just human. The claim to power is the claim to speak for the commonality of humanity. And that really resonated with me when I read it. So people do design, maintain these systems of racism. This is a book by Audre Lorde. I would recommend you read some of her work if you haven't already. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I think that's true. I think if we want to dismantle systems of racism, we need to look outside the system. And I'm turning more and more towards Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Māori ways of thinking and being. And I think that is the future, to be honest. Decolonization and indigenization of our health system and our wider society, I think, should be the future that we aspire to. But I think we all have a responsibility to try and disrupt this very pervasive system that creates inequity, that has inequity baked into it, really. So what's our role as doctors? I think we've got a lot to offer. We can challenge, we can model, we can support Māori worldviews in health, support Māori aspirations, and we can learn to identify bias and racism in ourselves, the system, and disrupt it. So next steps I'd recommend, continue to educate yourself. I'm so glad that you've come this evening. Thank you for being here, and do try and keep learning and keep thinking and talking about these things, using your peer groups perhaps, but keep going on this journey. These are the key areas that I've tried to really focus on myself and try and learn more about. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Te Ao Māori, health equity, anti-racism, cultural safety. I would recommend trying to pronounce Kupu Māori correctly. It's really important. It's not that difficult, and you never know, you might develop a love for it, as I have, and kept learning. I just wanted to say as well that the Māori distrust of white people in our institutions and programs and research is completely rational because of, you know, what's happened in the past. So sometimes you have to overcome that when you're working with Māori, and it can take a while to build that relationship and that trust, and that's completely rational. Remember that Māori do bring the history of their people with them to consultations, so do you. So history is important, and it's really, really critical to be aware of your own social conditioning and start reflecting on how your views have been shaped. And it's try and do it with honesty, and do seek support from family and peers, because it can sometimes be quite unpleasant and painful to look at the dark side of yourself, your family, etc. Try and connect with Māori any opportunity you can. Don't culturally load them, but find out how your service can best meet their needs, and be open and humble and open-minded. A Mokopuna-centric future. So that's something that the great Moana Jackson said, the idea that Te Ao Māori is Mokopuna-centric. It deliberately thinks about sustainability, the future, being kaitiaki, protecting for future generations, a holistic view, which is quite different really from Te Ao Pākehā. I think that should be our future. And I'll just leave you with the words of Witi Ihimaera, who said, "It's our watch now, the time to make dreams come true. Today is a good day to begin." Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Wow, e mihi ana ki a koe e hoa. That was a brilliant opportunity for our teachers, for our educators to pull in some tools to give us all an opportunity to dig a bit deeper, to look at what we don't know, and with the stuff that we don't know, do some mahi to know, to ensure that we aren't perpetuating inequities. You've brought a number of things for us all to think about, and I hope that you all have been able to take notes. I know this has been recorded, but just in case you can't access the recording for whatever reason, you've taken notes to enable you to look a bit further, and therefore grab some, maybe develop some resources for you to teach your own registrars and your colleagues, and maybe your bosses too. So thank you very much, Bronwyn. And so we haven't had any questions, so we'll just move on to our next wonderful speaker. So many of you will know Dr. Kyle Eggleton really well. He is an academic. He is Associate Dean Rural of the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, and a senior lecturer at the Department of General Practice at the University of Auckland. As I said earlier, Kyle is a board member for our academic Tāhuhu board for the college, and also a rural GP in the Hokianga, who has for a long time lived with and worked with iwi Māori. Kyle has covered many kaupapa within his research, with focus on rural health and equity, which has grown on the back of him conducting his own audit of medical practice, identifying he was less likely to prescribe cholesterol lowering drugs, medications to Māori once upon a time. And I know myself, and I know Bronwyn, have talked about Dr. Kyle's audit, because it's really important when we're thinking about health equity, cultural safety, and of course our implicit biases. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite you in, Kyle, to give us your kōrero about your own decolonisation experience and journeys. Kia ora.
Well, kia ora, Sarah, thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa no ko te rāna o ko tūpuna, e tai mai o ko tūpuna ki Aotearoa, e te tau tekau mā waru, rima tekau mā onu, ko Roy Donaldson rawa, ko Audrey Christie o ku kaumātua, ko Des Eggleton rawa, ko Elspeth Dons o ku kaumātua. E tepu ake au ki Waima, e noho ana au ki Ruakaka, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So as Sarah said, I'm a rural GP based in Northland, actually working in the Hokianga, and also the Associate Dean of Rural Health at the University of Auckland. So I'm going to talk about my perspective of decolonisation and move on a little bit from what Bronwyn has talked about. So she's given us this fantastic overview of racism and also talked about the impact of colonisation. So I'm going to describe my own journey and what I've learned so far, and begin with I want to lay a foundation that the process of decolonisation involves understanding ourselves, and that really begins with understanding our own history. So my own family's history is that on my father's side, we settled in Southland and Taranaki in the mid-1800s. My father comes from Danish and Scottish and Irish and German and English ancestry. And on my mother's side, my ancestors settled in Northland, also in the mid-1800s. And she comes from Scottish and Irish Catholic and Irish Protestant and English and Norman French ancestry. And this photo that you're seeing is a photo of Marangai, which is the name of our homestead. But Marangai means the east wind, as it faces east over a small little town in Northland called a Kaihau. And it was built in about the 1870s by my Canadian Irish ancestors. This is my great-grandfather's storage box. It was built from a kauri tree. You can see it's got my great-grandfather's name there. J.H. Donaldson, and the name Marangai. And ironically, it was a kauri tree that killed his father. That's my great-great-grandfather, who was involved with the logging of kauri. So essentially, my own family was involved in the colonisation of land. And this colonisation involved not only remodelling the land, but also renaming it. Donaldson Road in the Kaihau, named after my Donaldson family. Scudder's Beach, named after my Scudder family, and they ran the Keri Keri Stone store. McLeod's Bay and Whangarei Harbour, where my McLeod ancestors settled. So these names have been stamped over and supplanted the original Māori names and imposed a Western worldview over the landscape. The reason the map looks this way is because this is often the way in which Indigenous people, Māori, may view the world. I remember when I was a small boy growing up, my classmates would say that they were going up to Auckland, and we were living in Northland, a little place called Waima. And I would always correct them and say, oh no, you go down to Auckland. So there was my Western white view on the world in display there. So I think it's important to critique our language. A few weekends ago, I was doing a tidy up in my room, and I discovered some letters that my grandfather had written to me when I was living in Papua New Guinea. My grandfather was a lovely, kind and gentle man, and I really loved him. However, in the letters, he'd written some quite racist comments, and it really shook me up reading those letters, because I'd not seen my grandfather as being a racist, and I couldn't remember him saying those things. And it must have meant that those comments would have washed over me due to the everydayness of them and the ordinariness of them, just reflecting the inherent inbuilt racism of my family and myself at that time. And this critique of language is important to do as part of decolonisation. And I'm kind of trying to work through this process of what decolonisation actually means. So this, I don't know whether any of you know who this is, but this is a rather famous painting by Lindau of Tamati Wakanene. He was a Ngāpuhi rangatira who was also from the Hokianga, and he sold a block of land where our kaihau is to the Crown in the 1860s. And this block of land was given to my ancestors, who, as I mentioned, were mostly Canadian Irish, to settle. And I've used the word settle provocatively here, as our language is worthy of critique. I've always been proud of my ancestors, as I mentioned, that come from Ireland to Canada and moved to Canada in 1810, and then later to New Zealand in the 1850s and 60s. And as part of my process of consultation, I often do a whakawhanaungatanga. And I was describing my ancestry to a particular patient a little while ago. It was a kaumātua. And he said, well, where your family's from is the land that my whānau had taken from us. The other day, I got a family history book from a cousin, and she described the land sale from Wakanene to the Crown and how the local hapu had not been paid correctly. And consequently, there's some disagreement between them and my ancestors when it came to ownership and grazing of livestock. And the eventual agreement at that time in the 1800s was that whenever a cow or pig was killed, half would go to the hapu and half to my Canadian settlers' ancestors in the kaihau. I felt really perturbed reading the story and reflecting on the interaction with my patient that I mentioned, realising that the word settler implies that the land was bare and vacant, where in fact land required displacement of others. Analysing our own history also involves analysing how our history has shaped our privileges. And in the previous example, the very fact that my family retained that block of land in a kaihau for 3 or more generations before my grandfather sold it, and then I inherited some money from him when he died, has meant a transfer of wealth down the generations. And I've directly benefited from that. But there are other more subtle forms of privilege beyond direct transfer of wealth that can occur. So this is a picture of me. In the picture, I'm the cute little white baby in the centre of the picture. And I always thought this picture was quite humorous, but there's something deeper going on. What privileges operated at this time that allowed my mum to bring her baby, that's me, to work? And just my mum is the teacher. Mum and dad were the school teachers at Waima Primary, so Waima is in the Hokianga, just down the road from a kaihau. Would the Department of Education have allowed a Māori teacher to have her children in the classroom for the entire time? And kind of when I started thinking about this picture and critiquing and analysing it, I thought, I don't think that Department of Education in the 1970s would have allowed a Māori teacher to bring her child to school. So essentially, I was at school from the age of 1, and my sister, who was born after me, was at school from the age of 9 months. Over the years, I've done a lot of reflecting on my own privileges, and I've used art and writing and poetry. And this piece of art I made was made after viewing a piece of work by an Aboriginal artist in Melbourne, and then thinking about the stories that many of my patients had and contrasting their experiences to mine. So my patients would often tell me things like how they'd pull up at the petrol pump and it was a prepay and they would have to go in and pay. And I thought, well, I never had to do prepay when I'm at the petrol pump. I just look over towards the attendant and nod and they unlock the pump for me. And I remember some patients, an elderly Māori woman, telling me how whenever she went into a shop, the shop assistant would ask to take her bag in case she was going to steal things. And, you know, that's never happened to me because I'm white and I'm male. So there's all these kind of layers of privilege that I think, you know, I've reflected on over a long period of time. This made me realize that privilege is not just about wealth, but it's about these advantages that we have within our society if we're not Māori. Although I'm presenting this idea of decolonisation in a fairly stepwise manner, the reality is that our own personal change often occurs in a non-linear fashion. And as Sarah mentioned, one of the very first things I did was to analyse my own bias. So I was working as a GP in a small rural northern town. And I thought that I would audit my own prescribing patterns, as Sarah said. What I found was that my prescribing was quite inequitable. I had lower rates of prescribing appropriate medication to Māori. And from then on, I really began to analyse my consultations with Māori patients, and I realised that I had racist thoughts and preconceptions. I would think that Māori would not want to take a particular medication or that they'd be non-compliant. So I got into a habit of becoming more aware of my thoughts and biases with my interactions with others. And I started to listen to the noisy chatter that went on in my brain. And this realization of bias was operating in me, then it was also operating in our health system. And I started to look at inequalities more broadly. And I quickly realized that the structure of the primary care system was racist and that there were other models of healthcare delivery that addressed health need better. And so I set up a free health clinic in the local hall, working with a Māori health provider. And those clinics slowly expanded over time to include 6 rural out clinics around Northland. We got a van and we'd take our van out to the communities and people would come to see us without appointments. Often these little places we went to had no community clinic or community centre. So the van became quite a useful way of breaking down barriers. And most of our staff are Māori, which helped as well. About a year ago, I shifted jobs to work for another Māori health provider, Haura Hokianga, back where I grew up as a child and near to where my Donaldson family colonised. And it's been quite confronting at times, seeing patients whose lands were given to my family and seeing the socioeconomic pressures that they face and the disadvantage that they have in our society. Also confronting, but less so, has been seeing patients that used to change my nappies as a baby. I realised that inequities were ubiquitous in our society, and I began to get very upset with what I saw. Sometimes I heard confronting racist remarks from colleagues, and at other times I saw more subtle forms of racism. And everywhere there was structural racism, as Bronwyn's mentioned. I started to try and address what I saw as the failings in our healthcare system by advocating for my patients and undertaking media interviews, but also started to get involved in politics, and I got elected to the Northern DHB. One of the major learnings that I took from this process was that as I found myself with more power, I slipped into the trap of speaking out on issues with more authority than I already had. And I reflected that I was doing things at times to strengthen my own position. What I eventually learned was that authority and power was best utilised when it was for the benefit of others, and that I needed to ask opinions of others, such as Kaumātua and Kuia and Māori health leaders, before I went blundering around being a white saviour. I also need to be brave, as one Kuia told me, and be able to be the only one in the room to speak out on things that weren't right or just. But I think that the bravest thing to do is not necessarily become involved in politics or to undertake media interviews, but is to confront the personal expressions of racism that we encounter every day. And this is my challenge to you. So I'm going to finish with a poem I wrote about one particular encounter when I wasn't brave, and it involved a GP who said a particular racist comment about Māori to me. And I felt so confronted that I could not respond in the manner that I wanted to, and I felt sick afterwards. And this poem is called My Response to the Racist. He stared at me intently with fervent eyes, gleaming brightly, and I watched his lips spit out the words, twisting darkly. I felt his sounds touch my soul, ripping quietly, but my voice was silent, lost in indecision, blathering stupidly. I snuck away, avoiding his shadows, clinging coldly, and wept some tears of anger and rage, feeling cowardly. I imagined myself being the opposite, feeling bravely, clean hotly, blathering wittily, ripping loudly, twisting lightly, gleaming darkly, as I stared at him intently. So, kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Kyle. What a beautiful way to finish your kōrero, and actually got my goosebumps going. Took me back to the documentary last night, if you didn't watch it, whānau, called No Māori Allowed. If you can get access that documentary, I think it will really bring home some of the kōrero that you're hearing here tonight, because it was reality here, and you will feel it in your heart by watching that documentary, just as we have now listening to Kyle. So thank you for that, Kyle. I hope we are looking at our implicit biases. I hope we are assessing them. I hope we are addressing them, and I hope we're monitoring them too. We really need to be challenging each other. Again, I say this again, as colleagues, as friends, as people who care for our communities, to be better. And I know all of you are amazing at what you do already, but we do need to be better to help achieve a level of health equity that we as Māori absolutely aspire to. And so may you challenge your managers to think about how clinics, services can be delivered in a way that ensures the resource is there for those in your community who need it, be they Māori or not. And so when we think about implicit biases, when we think about the need to critically self-reflect, then that brings me to the wonderful Dr. Lucy O'Hagan, who many of us know well. She is an outstanding poet and GP, and she has been our lead for the multi-use educator Rōpū this year, and also a medical educator in Wellington. And so she will have supported many of you during this year, if not in years gone by, to be able to teach as well as you can your GPEP registrars. She's also been supporting the registrars who need a little bit more manaakitanga for whatever reason with her rōpū whakatipu. So Lucy is doing a lot behind the scenes that none of you will have any idea about actually. So she is part of why this cultural safety webinar is being stood up this evening. And so thank you to you, Lucy, for ensuring that this has come to fruition. So Lucy, some of you may not know this, but Lucy was the recipient of the college's Eric Elder Memorial Medal back in 2016. And during her conference address, she invited GP whānau to adopt a reflective, patient-centered doctor narrative approach in general practice. And so hence she is with us tonight to stimulate thought about cultural safety within consultation. So I'll hand over to you, e hoa nau mai.
Thank you, Sarah. And kia ora tātou. Ko tititea te munga, ko mata o te awa. No hawera ho, ka noho o ki waikanai. Ko Lucy O'Hagan, tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I did that not too badly. I'm just hoping I can share my screen. Otherwise, I'll just wing it. I am feeling completely amazed by the two people who've come before me, and I've got slight imposter syndrome, but I'm just working my way through that, and I'm going to move into what I was going to talk about. The first thing I was going to say is that it's been quite a liberation to me to acknowledge the racism in me, and I love the way Bronwyn and Kyle have referred to that, and the fact that the very fact that I accept my white middle class privilege with inaction and my intergenerational wealth with inaction actually makes me racist. And the thing I like about it is that I spent most of my life thinking that I'm one of the nice ones, and it's those people over there who are racist because I'm really nice. And actually, it's a very defensive position where you're kind of cornered. And the liberation of actually acknowledging my own racism is that what happens now is that I actually notice the thoughts that go through my head. And I go, oh, wow, did that just happen? Did I just think that thing that actually is a piece of negative stereotyping, or, you know, a piece of kind of slightly, and so I think that then we're in a position to actually recognise what we're thinking and do something about it. Having said all that, I'm a complete beginner in this space because I've spent most of my career in a very white middle class practice, and it was only as a young doctor and in the last 5 years that I have worked in marginalised communities. And if someone has a better term than high needs practice, because I put it in the Q&A because it's such a bad term, I can't bear it. Anyway, I had the experience like Bronwyn of feeling not infrequently in consultation with Māori that I get stuck, and that there's something that's not quite working. And so what I wanted to focus on tonight, and partly because my interest is in teaching the consultation, is on cultural safety in the consultation. I don't actually know anything about this topic. I just like asking questions. So I'm not going to actually, I'm going to ask some questions and then I'm going to postulate some answers. But what I'm actually really interested in is starting a conversation, because I think that we've got a wee way to go in terms of understanding what a culturally safe consultation might actually look like. I don't think that we really are quite there yet. So according to the Medical Council statement, which I'd really encourage you to go onto the Medical Council website and look at their cultural safety statement, says that critical reflection on our own culture, our assumption and judgments is a huge part of cultural safety, as well as reflecting on power in the consultation. So the assumptions that I want to talk about tonight are the assumptions that we have about how to be a doctor and the existing models that we have for being a GP, like patient-centred medicine and the Calgary-Cambridge model. And I want to reflect on the tension between those models and what might be required to be a culturally safe practitioner that incorporates Hauora Māori models or integrate them into their practice. Because I think there is actually a real tension. And it's great that there's a tension, and it's great that we're having this conversation, because I think what's actually going to happen is that we're going to create this very unique kaupapa around what it is to be a GP in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is distinct from what I will call the Eurocentric models of patient-centred medicine and Calgary-Cambridge, which really arose out of mainly North America and the UK. And those are the models that we prominently teach. And to be fair, those models have transformed medicine in general practice in the last 30 years, but I don't think they go far enough. And the reason we're talking about this is that we're at a point in history where there's huge cultural and political forces and huge inequities. And we're really heading towards a destination that we can't quite see called decolonisation. And if you do go onto the Medical Council website, I think, is Curtis Walter, I think he's the first Māori chair of the Medical Council. Anyway, they've done just incredible work on researching and doing a literature search on cultural safety. The other thing that's happening in this space is that the college's new curriculum now includes domains on te tiriti and also equity, and just gone up in the Hauora Māori curriculum is this most fantastic document written by the equity team, which is like, you just have to read it. So go onto the curriculum and read that document, because it's an absolute game changer. So the other thing that's happened is this year is that the marking rubric for the clinical exam has been changed to a global marking assessment, and it includes cultural safety. And this is the definition of cultural safety in that marking rubric. And you'll notice that it includes relating to people. It's in a sense relating people who are different from me, the practitioner, but also people who are marginalised, which includes groups other than Māori, although this conversation tonight is mainly about Māori. And you'll notice that they talk about whakamana tangata and autonomy and shared decision making, which I'm going to come back to. And then there's a description in the rubric of what an excellent candidate would look like. And I don't think I'd get an excellence, but I'd hope I'd get a borderline, and maybe I'd get a good, because this is really hard. So it includes integrating Māori models, whakawhanaungatanga, being a pro-equity practitioner. This is actually not business as usual. This is a challenge to us as teachers to articulate what this might look like. And the great thing is that assessment drives learning. So we as teachers need to be ready to have these conversations. Do we even know what a culturally safe consultation looks like? I've been puzzling this myself. So here's the first of my questions. Why is whakawhanaungatanga so difficult to teach? And this is a really, really interesting problem, because we've been trying to teach registrars this process of whakawhanaungatanga for about 5 or 6 years. And for me, that's meant trying to understand what the concept means myself, let alone the first 6 months of trying to pronounce it. So it's a journey for the teacher. And in this whole process, we're going to be learning and teaching simultaneously. So what I understand, and I don't know, this isn't necessarily correct, but this is where I've got to with it, is that in a Māori world, whakawhanaungatanga between Māori people would be a sharing of whakapapa and a creating of connection through interconnected ancestry, connected between whānau, connection with whenua, and in some way that I don't quite understand, there's some wairua threaded through all of that. So I understand that if we're talking about a consultation between a Pākehā or Tauiwi doctor and a Māori patient, that's going to look slightly different. But what I do understand that is way more than rapport building. And I've been reflecting on why it's so difficult to get the registrars to do this. And the first thing is that I think that my sense is that whakawhanaungatanga is asking us to prioritise relationship. It's telling us that in a Māori world, relationship has to happen first, because that's the beginning point. That creates trust and safety. And this resonates to a certain extent with a philosophical position in academic general practice in the last 10 years, where there's a movement from patient-centred care to relationship-centred care, and an acknowledgement that relationship is the medium through which the patient accesses the medicine. But this is in conflict with our clinical priorities. So what registrars will often do is they'll increase their rapport a little bit and do a bit of introductory chat, and then they'll launch into firing medical questions. And I can't seem to get to the point where they can actually thread relationship right through the consultation. And I think that we as teachers need to articulate that process and to explain this idea of relationship-centred care as the sort of basis of this. The second thing I think Whakawhanaungatanga is asking us to do, and as I say, I'm a beginner, so don't quote me on this. I think it's asking us to be warm and welcoming and actually relaxed. And I think one of the problems for the registrars is that they've been taught this very formal way of being a doctor. So they tend to launch into this thing in a very formal way and say things like, well, I'll introduce myself, then you introduce yourself. And it actually, frankly, doesn't work. And I think that comes from a position in medicine that says that the archetypal doctor is an objective, detached, scientific observer. And we don't even realise that we have that in us, but that is actually the archetype. The problem with the detached, objective observer is that they're not actually present as a human being. You can't do whakawhanaungatanga unless you're present as a human being. So I think there's a tension for the registrars in getting rid of some of that formality. And the third thing that's being asked of us is to self-disclose. And I think registrars find that really difficult because they've been told that self-disclosure is the slippery slope to a boundary violation. And again, I think that experienced GPs actually are probably better at this and probably more naturally do these things because they have intuitively learned that if you value relationship and if you're warm and welcoming and if you're self-disclose a bit, we know from the literature that GPs do self-disclose a lot, that's actually helpful. What we need to do as teachers is say, what are the times when self-disclosure works and what are the times when it's a problem? So I think we need to be able to articulate the tensions and then discuss how to resolve it. Now, whakawhanaungatanga is, as I understand it, a concept that is particular to consultations with Māori. But what I want to say about it is once the registrars have been there, and all of us have been there, and we've actually experienced what it's like for that to work, and we've seen the magic that happens when you can build relationship in that way, then there's no going back because you're not going to go back to your other consultations with non-Māori patients and start being formal again because you kind of realise that was silly. So in a sense, I think that this process we're in is transformative of the way that we're going to see general practice. And that is a beautiful thing. So the next question is, what is mana enhancing care? And, you know, there's probably a lot of people who've thought about this harder than I have. But for me, it sort of resonates a little bit with something that comes out of the Eurocentric GP models, which is called unconditional positive regard. And that concept has been very powerful to me in my career because it's the recognition that if I stand in a position where I view the patient through a positive lens and I try the hard as I can to suspend judgment, that is the space that creates trust and safety. And that is the space that actually is therapeutic. So I sort of had understood that through my career. But I think that the other part of it is that it's getting us to not see people in a deficits way, what's wrong with them, but to see people in a strengths way. But I have a sense that mana enhancing care is asking us to do something a little bit more than that. And it's just really interesting to ask ourselves what that might be. And I'm wondering if it's about, at the end of the consultation, the patient feels more valued, more empowered, that their whānau have the right to have aspirations and have the capacity to reach those aspirations. And how amazing would it be if patients left with that mana enhanced? And that's a beautiful thing. except I think there's a fundamental problem in the room, and that is that doctors suck up all the mana that's available. And we actually do that quite unconsciously, and I think Kyle was referring to it in his sense of using power wisely. So I, like most of you, my first day at medical school was told I was the cream of the crop, and I've spent 30 years in a highly prestigious role where people highly value me, they trust what I say, they give me lots of responsibility. And even though I absolutely reject that kind of, I actually kind of reject that kind of thing at some level. At another level, there's a bit of me that sits quite comfortably in it. And it's that bit that sits comfortably, and I sort of justify that by saying there's something about the power of the role that actually helps in the consultation. So it's a balance between not taking too much of it, but having enough that you can actually have some sort of apostolic power, it's called. But I think what we need to do is access humility, and people have described this to me as a process where we whakaiti ourselves, we make ourselves smaller, that allows the other person to have more mana. And so I have a beautiful demonstration of this. I work in what I don't want to call a high needs practice, an iwi organisation, and I have a consulting room which has one of those office chairs in it that has a lever that makes the seat go up and down. But unfortunately, the mechanism doesn't work very well. And so about twice a day when I sit down, the seat just plummets right down to the bottom. And I end up sitting nearly on the ground with my knees around my chin. And it's highly comical, like it's a very funny moment because I look absolutely ridiculous. And it's very sudden and unexpected. And when this first started happening, I thought, oh my God, I have to get a bit of chair though. I can't go around looking ridiculous like that. I'm a doctor. It's just, can't have a chair like that. And then I didn't quite get around to getting the chair, and it kept on happening. And then I realized it was a very fundamental shift in the room when that happened. When I was humbled by my chair falling away, something happened to the patient that was absolutely electric. And I don't know what that was, but I'm wondering if that's some shift in the mana from me going into them. And I don't know if that's a correct description, but I've never got rid of the chair now. It's the best thing in the consultation. So there's a conversation for us to have about what that might look like. The next question is, what's stopping us sharing power? The interesting thing is that in all the reading I've done on the sort of philosophy of general practice and patient-centered medicine and the Calgary-Cambridge model and all these things, I have never heard a doctor talk about power in the consultation. When I've read things written by patients about consultations, it's all about power. So we need to start thinking about power. And the first thing is that the doctor's room is a representation of the power of the state. And if you've been subjected to colonisation, the state isn't a safe place to be. And fundamentally, that room isn't a safe place to be. I also had a very interesting conversation a few years ago with Brett Mann about his observations about doctors' chairs are always bigger than patients' chairs. Doctors always have a really fancy chair and the patient has a shitty chair. But not only that, the doctor's chair usually sits a little bit higher than the patient's chair. So you're actually looking down at the patient. Oh, here's another chair story. I worked in a very funny little sort of clinic that was a free clinic for a very disenfranchised group of people, homeless people, people who've been in and out of prison, people with addictions. And no one had a decent chair. The patient and I both had a chair that was like the worst chair in the worst waiting room from hell, ragged, terrible. And at home, I had this chair that it was a bit surplus to requirements. It was this really funky red chair, and it had a sort of 60s, 70s vibe, and it was red velvet. And I thought, I'm going to take that into that room and I'm going to give it to the patients to sit on. So patients walked into the room and there was this fantastic chair and I was in the shitty chair. And I'd say, oh, have a seat. And honestly, the reaction in the people to being given this magnificent chair was actually better than anything I did in the consultation, but honestly better than anything. There was absolutely physical response of kind of bewilderment and shock and then joy at being able to sit in this magnificent chair. So thinking about things like chairs is thinking about power. It's quite confronting to ask ourselves what it would be like if we shared power in a consultation. Because essentially, the way we run a consultation, even with our beautiful patient-centered methods, is that it privileges the biomedical agenda, or actually the body. The most important thing is the most important thing in the consultation. So even in our models where we think we're being really marvellous, we tell registrars to give the patient 1.5 minutes to speak freely at the beginning of the consultation. And this is a 15-minute consultation. I don't think there's power sharing. I think we really need to challenge ourselves on that. And then we have a thing where some way down the consultation, we allow the patient to express their ideas, concerns and expectations. Although in reality, we often only ask one of those questions. I heard a fantastic thing today of a registrar who'd sat in with a Māori GP who started the consultation with the ICE 5 questions. Didn't ask any medical questions, asked all the patient's ideas, concerns and expectations after the whakawhanaungatanga. And then when that was all done and it had a complete picture, and I thought, why didn't I think of that? That is beautiful. So, and then we get to the end of the consultation and there's a piece in Calgary, Cambridge that says shared decision making. And I was talking to some registrars about this the other day because they were asking me how to do it. And I had this light bulb moment where I thought, actually, I don't do it. What I do is I go, this is what I think's going on. Here's what I think you should do. Here's a script and here's an information sheet. Have you got any questions? And it was quite a nasty revelation for me. So I think shared decision making needs to come into it. And then the other thing we talked about is the consultation also privileges the biomedical way of seeing as the right way of seeing. So if we think about the Te Whare Tapawhā, so in my consultations, I probably spend 85% of the time on tinana and 10% on hinengaro and 5% on whānau. And about twice a year, I'd speak to someone about Wairua, and that's probably because it's a death and dying consult. And I'd say I'm fairly typical. What that does is that that biomedical lens is okay if the patient shares that lens and that they share that worldview and those values. But if they don't, if they're Māori and they don't have a mind-body split and the body, their body is part of a collective of bodies and the spirit is bound with the body, then there needs to be space for that way of seeing in the consultation. That's, I think, what sharing power is. Well, I'm on a roll now. One last question. What does trust look like in a colonised world? I've had experiences myself as a patient and sitting in with my own whānau when they're having consultations with doctors. And I've observed this thing, which is there's a moment in a consultation where if the patient is going to do what the doctor suggests, be it medication or surgery or even just believing the doctor's diagnosis, there's this moment where there's a leap of faith and the patient has to trust the doctor. And it's a really big moment. And we don't talk about trust. I've never read about trust anywhere. Do we understand what engenders trust in a consultation? Our models don't talk about trust. They don't talk about power. We assume, I think, that being trustworthy is being professional. But of course, that works for some people. But for others, being professional is deeply untrustworthy. because it's professional people who really done them over. So as a Pākehā middle-class GP with a Māori patient, I have to accept that I might look like a descendant of the people who stole your land. It might be that it's my cousin who was the cop that's pulled your son over last night. And I might sound a little bit like the woman from Oranga Tamariku who took your moko. So I have to work really hard to earn trust, really hard. And I don't even know if I know how to do that, but I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. I've sometimes had a lot of trouble crossing that divide, and what I'm thinking is that perhaps it's about circling back to where I started, to actually going back to whakawhanaungatanga, building mana, power sharing, and being humble. And I think maybe if we circle around that for a bit longer and we all start having conversations about it, we're going to get to this amazing place that we're a wee way off. Well, I certainly am, but closer to this goal of the culturally safe consultation. Thank you.
Tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā koe, e hoa. Thank you, Lucy. Your kōrero brought up a couple of things for me. And I think your kōrero was really helpful for our teachers who are, like you say, trying to manage the technicalities of teaching whakawhanaunga, of teaching concepts of cultural safety to our registrars and to each other. Because it is, though we have frameworks, though we have education about it, it's still being able to apply your own flavour to that teaching. And you talked about whakawhanaunga and whether or not there was a wairua through it. Well, whakawhanaunga is absolutely about connection. It's about connection between people, connection to our ancestors, our past, connection to our whenua. And so there is absolutely a wairua through that, and we can describe that wairua as toto, or our blood. Many of us as Māori will say we can trace our whakapapa, or our genealogy back to Ranginui and Papatuanuku, our sky father and our earth mother. And so that whakawhanaunga is hugely important in consultation, but actually just between people in general. We as Māori have been conditioned to believe we are a burden on society. And there is this distrust for many of us that is deep-seated, and as a result of intergenerational trauma will not ever go away for any of us. So when I talked at the beginning of with my kōrero, that first interaction with a Māori patient, with actually anyone, is the most critical time to be able to connect, to be able to whakawhanaunga and enable trust from that patient. And, you know, within the health system, we have no choice but to be trustworthy people, because we are medico-legally bound to be that person. So whakawhanaunga is absolutely about connection. It is absolutely about trust. It is absolutely about that unconditional positive regard that you mentioned earlier. And by enabling whakawhanaunga, by ensuring that we as clinicians share a little bit of ourselves to perhaps find that little bit of common ground that is going to make our patients pull closer and want to trust, then we have to do what we have to do. And in our Western system, we are constantly being prevented from providing a mana enhancing consultation, because we've got 15 minutes to do that. And I know that Kyle and some of our other docs around the world, the country here, have been privileged enough to have 20-minute appointments, and we do need to be able to stretch that way. So thank you very much for your thought-provoking kōrero, Lucy. There's lots to think about there, and lots for our GP teachers who have been GP teachers for a long, long time and have had these sorts of kōrero for a long, long time, but it's getting bigger and more meaningful and purposeful now with the way that our health system is going, without the way that our country is moving now. And so I'm just going to have a quick look at the Q&A. Right. We've had lots of comments regarding underserved populations.
I think people were answering the question about what do you say other than high needs.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, so, cool.
Yeah. The ideas were an underserved community and oppressed people. Just scrolling through, and I love a comment from Alistair, who says to patients, "I don't expect you to trust me," which helps them strangely trust. And I think "I don't expect you to trust me" is a sort of it has a level of humility in it, probably, as well.
Excuse the dog barking in the background. So we've come to, it's 8:30, and so it's supposed to be an hour-and-a-half webinar. I guess, you know, there's been lots of kōrero covered, and hopefully there's a little bit of everything that you can take home, that you can mull over and think about how you can use it within your teaching, both within the practice and within the seminars that some of you are teaching also. I'll hand it over to you, Bronwyn.
Oh, kia ora, Sarah. I just see that my good friend and an all-round wonderful person, Rachel Heighton, has just popped a question into the chat for us. Oh, yeah. She asks, ideas how to bring team along for this journey when everyone is really tired already, tend to shy away from more mahi. It's a really good question. Any thoughts?
Well,
what I would say is, I mean, just in terms of the consultation, what I actually didn't say is that there's a huge amount of evidence that a huge percentage of patients do not take the prescriptions that we give them. They either don't fill them or and this is across the board. So we're doing something incredibly ineffective with the way we're doing things. And I think it probably comes down to power sharing and all of those things we've talked about. So in a sense, it's not really, we're actually looking at being culturally safe, but we're actually going to be more effective. And probably, I think, create less frustration and less kind of problems by walking towards this thing. I don't know if that answers Rachel's question.
Any other thoughts, Kyle or Bronwyn, with regards to that question?
Yeah, I think the work satisfaction is a big one, that I think if you can adopt a different way of working that connects with patients on a more human level, and you can be more humble and a bit more vulnerable even yourself, I think you will probably have better connections with people, and maybe that will foster a better sort of job satisfaction as well, because you know you're being more effective, you know you're creating those bonds with other people. And perhaps that will enhance staff well-being in a way as well. So perhaps that's an angle that you could, I don't know, use to help sell it a little bit, as well as addressing the inequity side. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Carl?
Yeah, I was going to say similar to Bronwyn. We're all health professionals are trying to do the best for their patients and clients, and it's the angle to really take, really, that, you know, we're trying to do the best we can, and this is an approach that will bring better outcomes.
Absolutely. And I guess if Rachel, what Orotoa could consider doing is having a look at the cultural safety guidelines on the Medical Council website, and have a look at Hiara Hauora, which is a pathway to achieving cultural safety, I guess, within your clinic and within your organisation. And maybe that could be a peer review discussion between you and your team of people. I know we're tired. We're at the coalface and we need to make a change. And actually we're already doing, like Kyle and Bronwyn have said, we're already doing good mahi, because we are in this game because we are empathetic and caring people, but we just need to reach a little bit more. And that might not be us individually, that might be the system surrounding you that needs to make the change. So peer review discussion. Any other questions there that have popped up? I seem to miss them.
I just want to thank the other people on the panel, because I don't usually participate in a webinar and feel completely inspired because but I usually feel stressed. I feel completely inspired, and what I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to start with the ICE questions. After the whakapanaunga, I'm going to thread it all together, and I'm going to just put away the medical questions and see what happens when I do that. So I think we start simple, and I think that'll be fascinating to see how that changes them.
Good point.
I think it's a really great journey to go on. You know, the decolonisation journey has been amazing for me. It's really changed my life, to be honest. And I just wanted to pick up on that comment that we made about peer groups. I mean, from my perspective, my peer group has been so invaluable to me to have the opportunity to speak safely about some of these issues together. They've been huge support for me. So I really would recommend that to you guys, is have those conversations together in a safe place, because sometimes it can be difficult. So explore those issues together. I've found huge support in that. It's really helped develop my thinking.
Yeah, I agree, particularly if you're a PHO with a number of clinics and you all sort of work in isolation under the same umbrella. So being able to come together to have a think about how you can embed te tiriti, how you can embed the principles of hiara hauora within your clinic setting is really important. And you can't do that if you're doing that in isolation of each other. Have we got one more question there? Thank you, Dawn, for your lovely compliment. And thank you, Vicky, for letting us know. It was fantastic. We've all been a little bit worried about how this might go, some more than others. But this is
I've been in a cold sweat most nights. But the liberation was thinking and saying to the team, well, if we watch this in 5 years and we cringe, we'll know we've done it.
I think it's a good start. It's a good start for our college to look into how we develop our cultural safety curriculum even more so. So with that in mind, I think it's time for us to wrap it up. But can I invite you, we don't have any particular feedback forms, but for those of you who are still on, can I encourage you to, if you know me or Lucy or Kyle, probably Lucy and I actually, send us an email with your feedback so we can think about how we can improve this. You can also send an email to communications@rnzcgp.co.nz because we need to know how this has gone so we can improve for next time. And so can I just say I sit here with these wonderful people wanting to help our educators with the notion of cultural safety, because I have two sons. My two sons are Māori, and I want them to live into their 90s. I want them to have great experiences within our health system, and I want them to stop feeling like they're a burden to society because they're Māori. And with these changes that we make, that we encourage our colleagues and our bosses to make, then that might just make the difference that encourages them to engage in health-seeking behaviours. So everybody have a nice rest of the evening. Look after yourselves and each other. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga a te mea ngaro, ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahia te hua mā kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu, kia whakamaua, kia tīna.
Tīna.
Haumie huie, tai.
Thank you.
For Māori, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Can our panelists stay on for a sec? Lots of great feedback there. I think people are still peeling away, but while they're still peeling away, can I just big
hugs
round
on
of
groups.
applause.
Group hug.
Thank
Come on,
you.
yes, feel the love.
Thank you so much. Each part of what you all brought tonight really, made a wonderful webinar. And I think it will be widely received when it's recorded, when it's delivered, the recording is delivered. So thank you so much for taking time out away from your whānau to do this, and all the time that you've spent to prepare your kōrero is much, much appreciated.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, for putting this together. Fantastic work.
Lucy?
And my panel, I mean, what a privilege to work with you. Honestly, I'm so chuffed. Thank you for having me. It's so wonderful to get to work with such fantastic GPs. Like, as an outsider, it's just, oh, I'm honoured. Thank you.
Well, I think you could come and be a GP now, Bronwyn.
You reckon that's all I need to do?
It's much more fun.
Oh, that was easy. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, any chance of us working together again, guys, please, let me know. I'd love to. This is, I care about this same as you guys. So if I can support in any way, just let me know.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
it feels like the beginning of a conversation. I mean, I was kind of, it was very interesting just reflecting on it.
Geetha, I wonder if you can just close the webinar off, because we've still got people hanging on.
Oh. Maybe it's
It's so awesome.
if-
People want more. It's fair enough. You can't blame them. Yeah.
Want more have walked away from their computer to grab a cup of tea, not realizing it's finished.
I think Geetha's not. Geetha, you there?
Yeah, I'm there, but it will close it for everybody. Is that all
I
right?
see.
Oh,
Right.
that's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll take care. And if we get feedback, Geetha and Lucy and I, then we will make sure that you all receive that, if that's okay, Geetha.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I enjoyed it myself. I'm getting 3 hours of CPD for this.
Yay! Awesome. Okay.
It brought back a lot of memories for me as well, especially
bet.
the decolonization aspect. So yeah, very,
Yeah.
very interesting. Thank you.
Beautiful. Okay, we'll let you go.
Oh, I
Have
just
you
want to
been-
carry on the conversation. I could talk to you guys all day and all night.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll meet again somewhere.
Yes, well, I have to
will
go
do.
because my son has just fractured his wrist, and I've just
Oh, no.
Oh no. Oh,
my wife has
Kyle.
texted me while we've been talking. So
Okay, you need
Oh
to
my
go.
gosh, yeah, go.
Mā te
Yeah.
atua e manaki.
Uh,
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Oh,
you.
Poor
Thank
Maddie
you.
whānau.
Thank you,
Well,
Geetha,
Maddie.
too.
Thanks,
Thank
Geetha.
you. Thanks,
Ka
Lucy.
kite.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Akite.
thanks, Geetha. for your
Thanks,
help.
Lucy.
was
Bye-bye.
really
Good
good.
night. Yeah.
Bye.
You did very well.